Welcome to the Great Commission Alliance Best Facts.
Welcome to Day 6 of the
Welcome to the Great Commission Alliance Best Facts Training. We are going to be jumping into some solid evidence over the next couple of weeks, training you how to defend your faith coherently. This is going to be an incredible time. You know, Christians have been defending their faith for 2,000 years, so this is not new. And there are a wealth of incredible Great Commission apologetics resources out there. Most of them are really long and focused on a specific topic, maybe on the resurrection, for example, or maybe on creation and evolution. The Best Facts kind of summarizes all these different strains of evidence and all these different arguments into a really easy to remember acronym and a coherent defense of your faith. You are going to love this training. Before we jump into it any further, though, I want to encourage you to go to greatcommissionalliance.org/training or just to the notes in the video description you're watching now to get the notes that we're using today and to follow along with us. I also want to point out a couple resources that we have. The first one is the Best Facts Workbook. That's going to be available at greatcommissionalliance.org/shop. So is the Best Facts Tract. The Best Facts Tract is developed for skeptics, and it is a solid resource for sharing your faith with those friends and neighbors and coworkers that might not yet be convinced of the truth of what we believe. So without any further ado, I want to jump into the training, but I want to start by reading 1 Peter 3:15. This is a classic passage on apologetics. It says, "But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect." All right, there's our challenge, to always be ready to give a defense for the hope that we have. In the Greek, the word there for give a defense is apologia, and it's the word that we get apologetics from. If you've ever been intimidated by the word apologetics, rest assured you're not alone. But we want to demystify it and simplify it and make it easy for you to engage in Christian apologetics. This is going to help you when you deal with doubt. It's also going to help you when you defend your faith, and it's also going to help you in discipleship when people that you're encouraging deal with doubt. This is going to be a great time together, and you're going to walk away with some incredible tools for defending your faith. So in Mark 12:30, Jesus tells us to love God with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength. And as Christians, we need to engage with the evidence and to love God with all of our mind. The Christian faith is one that is based in logic and reasoning. It's based in the truth. So we are going to jump into that, and I want you to get a few keys from that 1 Peter 3:15 verse that I just read you. The first one that I want you to catch is that we need to relinquish control. We need to acknowledge Christ as Lord when it comes to this topic of apologetics, specifically in the context of evangelism. There's a world that needs to know Jesus, and we need to be sharing the hope that we have. That's the next thing that I want you to catch. We need to resolve to be a light. See, He has called us to this. In Matthew 5, He's told us that He wants us to be bright, shining lights in this world for Him. We need to resolve to be a light. You know, it's impossible to always be ready to give an answer to anyone that asks us about the hope that we have if they don't know we have any hope. So it's in the context of sharing our hope that people will ask about our hope and that we'll be able to give a coherent and respectful response to them. The next thing that I want you to catch here is that we need to ready ourselves. It says always be ready. So we can't just sit around thinking, I hope I never have that awkward question come up. I hope I never have that time where I get put on the spot and don't know what to say. Instead of worrying about those times or being afraid of those times, we need to always be ready. We need to ready ourselves. Sometimes we don't even know where to start. Well, this is where we get to start this week. We are going to jump into the Best Facts training. This will be a great way to ready yourself. You know, the Bible tells us in 2 Corinthians 5 that we've been called to be God's ambassadors. And it says, because we know what the fear of the Lord is, we try to persuade men. You may have heard people say that you can't persuade someone or talk them into faith. Although the Holy Spirit is the one that has to work in somebody's heart as they come to faith, we absolutely can help persuade them of the truth of the gospel. That's what we're going to do today. You know, the Bible tells us that Paul persuaded people in Thessalonica, Athens, Corinth, Ephesus, Caesarea, and Rome. In all these places, it actually uses the word persuaded. We too can join with his example in persuading others of the truth of the gospel. Next, key number 4 is we need to reach out. It says always be prepared. We need to be diligent about sharing the hope that we have and being ready to answer when those questions come up. Jesus said in Matthew 9 that the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Let's reach out and not let the fear of apologetics or the fear of not knowing what to say hold us back. Okay, finally, this passage says to do this with gentleness and respect. You know, we need to engage with people in apologetics in a gentle way where we hear them out and where we respond to them not arrogantly, but out of love. You know, the best facts is going to equip you with a lot of information, but our hope as a ministry is that you would use the information we give you in a respectful and loving way, that you wouldn't bash people over the head with it. So with that, let's jump into the Best Facts acronym. In this first session, I'm just going to give you a short overview of the best facts. And then after this, in each additional session, we are going to go deep into those topics. So right now, let's just go over a brief review of the best facts. The BEST acronym gives us 4 arguments for God. Why do we know that God exists? Now, obviously, as a believer, you've been saved and transformed by the living God that created the universe. So these arguments aren't necessary for your faith. You already know Jesus. But these arguments are a great way to answer good questions that people have or to deal with your doubt when it comes up. So B, the B in BEST stands for the beginning of the universe. The beginning of the universe points to God. This is a fact that is extremely encouraging. The first and second laws of thermodynamics point to a supernatural origin of the universe. Logic also points to that same supernatural origin of the universe. Philosophers call it the Cosmological Argument for God's existence, and we're going to get into that in the very next session. E stands for the engineering of the universe. The engineering of the universe is all about the incredible detail and the meticulous planning even of all the different features of the universe. You know, statistically, there's no reason that we should be able to be here today. The incredible intelligence behind this universe points to an intelligent creator that created it. Let me tell you a few quotes from some skeptics who recognized design and attributed it to a creator. Physicist Paul Davies says, "There is for me powerful evidence that there is something going on behind it all, as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming." I couldn't agree more. Or how about this one from atheist astronomer Fred Hoyle? "A common-sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super-intellect has monkeyed with physics, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question." S in the BEST acronym stands for standards and morality. You know, the fact that you and I know certain things are wrong and certain things are right points to a standard of right and wrong outside of ourselves. See, if it was only just matter and atoms and molecules around us, and if we were only matter and atoms and molecules, there would be no right and wrong. Imagine Legos. My kids love playing with Legos. When Legos break or cause other Legos to break or pull apart or fall apart or crumble or whatever it might be, there is no moral right or wrong involved in it. It's just atoms and molecules coming apart. If we were only atoms and molecules, it would be no different. There would be no right or wrong. But we all know there is a right and there is a wrong. And the fact that we know that's true points to the fact that there is a standard outside of ourselves. In a few sessions, we'll get into this argument in more depth. But rest assured, it is a strong argument for the existence of God. You've probably heard of C.S. Lewis, the author of the Chronicles of Narnia and so many other phenomenal Christian works. He was an atheist intellectual that came to faith in Christ through the moral argument. You've also probably heard of the Human Genome Project that mapped the human genome. The PhD doctor that led that project, probably one of the greatest scientists of the last century, Dr. Francis Collins, also went from atheism to faith in Jesus Christ through the moral argument. So this is a strong and compelling argument for the existence of God. I want to go into the last one in the 4 arguments for God, and that is the truth about Jesus, T. The historical evidence for the resurrection is solid and irrefutable. In a few sessions when we get into that, I promise you'll be amazed. Dr. Gary Habermas is the biggest proponent in modern times of the evidence for the resurrection. Many have stood on his shoulders and done a great job defending that evidence as well, but he is kind of the top guy in that field. We're going to jump into a lot more of what he teaches in our session on that topic. But I will point out that he's endorsed the best facts training. So I'm so thankful that we get to be teaching this with the encouragement of somebody like Dr. Gary Habermas. Okay, that's the best arguments. Let me tell you the facts arguments. And these are 5 arguments for why we can trust the Bible. F stands for Foretells the Future. Did you know the Bible is full of prophecy? Between 1,000 and 2,000 prophecies, most of which have already come true. Others are still being fulfilled, even in our day and age. It's phenomenal. Let me tell you just one. Did you know that in Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, we read that there will be 483 Hebrew calendar years from the time that the decree to rebuild Jerusalem goes out. Now we know from Nehemiah 2 that happened in about 444 BC, okay? So 483 Hebrew calendar years equal about 476 solar years. Josh McDowell is the one responsible for some of these calculations. If you do the math, it works out that the Messiah was supposed to come and die for our sins in 33 AD. Almost 500 years before the fact, Daniel prophesied the exact time that Jesus would pay for your sins and mine. Amazing. There's prophecy like this throughout Scripture. We'll get into a lot more of that in a future session. A stands for archaeologically accurate. The Bible is archaeologically accurate. You're looking right now at a few different examples. There are hundreds of these. The Tel Dan inscription in the top left-hand corner there is the first evidence for King David. Amazing, amazing, amazing. The Hezekiah bulla that you're seeing there is one of the evidences for Hezekiah. There are many more, and there are many seals and bullae just like that one for different people from the Bible. The third thing that you're seeing there is one of the Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts. The Dead Sea Scrolls showed us the authenticity of the Old Testament text. Finally, you're also looking at the Pilate inscription, which tells us that Pilate was who the Bible says he was in the New Testament. These are just a few examples. There are many more, and we're going to get into that as we go on in this training. The next thing that we're going to look at is C. The Bible is coherent. It agrees internally with itself, it agrees with the rest of the external universe, and it agrees with you and me and our human condition. That's important. Even though it was written by about 44 different authors over the course of a couple millennia, it is coherent, and that's important. T, it's also translated correctly. The Bible has nearly 6,000 Greek manuscripts, another 18,000 translations from those that provide a way to check them, and then 80,000+ quotes from early church fathers that also give us a way to double check what was originally written. We can trust what we see in the Bible. We also have the Rylands papyrus, the earliest manuscript of the Gospel of John from about 20 years after John wrote the Gospel of John. Amazing fact that shows us the credibility of the New Testament and God's Word as a whole. We'll jump more into that soon. S stands for scientific statements. The Bible has many of these. In Genesis 1:1, we read that the whole universe began to exist a finite time ago. That's a scientific fact that science only found out about a century ago. The Bible said it first. It also says in verse 3 that it all began with light. You know, that's also a scientific fact. Steven Weinberg, Nobel Prize winner in physics, the author of The First 3 Minutes, and an absolute vicious atheist, says this. He says the universe was filled with light, and light formed the dominant constituent of the universe, talking about the beginning. Yep, Stephen, we knew that because the Bible told it to us. You know, in Genesis 1 through 4, we read of the first human beings, Adam and Eve, the parents of all mankind. Geneticists today have confirmed that we all come from one original mother and one original father. That's amazing. You know, there's so much more, but we'll have to get into that later. You know, why not other faiths? We're also going to deal with that in the Best Facts training. We have 2 more acronyms, the TALL acronyms. TALL stands for theological incoherence, ambiguous truth claims, the lack of evidence, and a lack of power to change lives. Those are some reasons that we don't accept other faiths. TAILS, why we don't accept atheistic evolution, stands for the transitionary evidence is lacking, the apparatus or mechanism is insufficient, life doesn't come from non-life, the existence of information is naturalistically inexplicable, and so is S, the start of the universe. We'll briefly dive into those acronyms and some of the evidence for why the other things are wrong, but we're going to keep our focus on the evidence for our faith. It's always better to defend our faith rather than just saying the other guys are wrong. I just want to make a note on that. Typically, atheists always do that. If you say, why are you an atheist? They'll say, well, the Christians don't have any evidence. Even if that were true, it wouldn't make atheism true. But thankfully, it's not true. We have a lot of great evidence. But we give positive arguments for our evidence. We don't just rely on negative arguments against the other guys. We're going to focus on the evidence for what we believe, not just ripping others. You know, as we conclude this short introduction, I want to encourage you as you come to apologetics, stay positive. Be gospel-focused, be loving, be respectful and caring, and stay positive. Don't get drawn off on sidetracks. So many Christians get into side issues like the age of the earth. I'm not going to criticize different people for different perspectives on that, but I want to encourage you to stay focused on the big picture issues. Let me read you what Ravi Zacharias says. Rather than spend our time debating for hours whether it's billions of years or whether it's thousands of years, we should instead be arguing for the fact that you cannot explain the full questions of life, origin, meaning, morality, and destiny without a personal moral first cause, which is God Himself. Let's stay focused on the big picture. Let's stay focused on the positives. You know, finally, as we talk about doing apologetics, I want to encourage you to listen well. Use these ears God gave you. Sometimes your friend will throw up smoke screens. They'll say evolution or atheism, and they might not even know what those things mean. I have rarely found an atheist that can intellectually support their atheism. Most people just throw out words like that. Listen carefully so that you'll know what's really going on, and you might find it's not even an apologetics issue, it's a heart issue. Be sensitive to where they're at and be willing to meet them there as you do apologetics. I hope this was a great little intro to the best facts for you. We're going to be unpacking more each and every week. As we summarize, I want to encourage you that this tool will help you deal with your own doubt. It will help you do discipleship, and it will help you share your faith and answer those hard questions when they come up. Hey, don't miss the next training. You really need to get all the Best Facts trainings. You can get those at greatcommissionalliance.org/training. We're going to be posting our videos there. There will be a Best Facts tab for you. You don't want to miss these trainings. While you're there, download the PDF that you can take notes on so that you could be taking notes as we go through this time. And please go to greatcommissionalliance.org/shop, buy the Best Facts book, and buy the Best Facts Tract so that you can be sharing some of this with your non-Christian friends. Hey, we'll catch you in the next Best Facts training. Hey, welcome back to the second session in the Best Facts training. Today we're going to be going over B, the beginning of the universe, the first argument in the Best Facts for the existence of God. This is going to be a great training. Before we go any further, though, I want to remind you that you can get the Best Facts workbook. This is a great tool for Christians, and you can get the Best Facts track for skeptics, both at GreatCommissionAlliance.org/shop. That's GreatCommissionAlliance.org/shop. You know, as we start this video too, I want to remind you that you can get a PDF of the notes that you could be following along with on the video description that you're watching now. If you have trouble finding it there, you could also find it under the Best Facts tab at GreatCommissionAlliance.org/training. I hope that's all you need to get what you need to get all that you can out of this training. Hey, as we jump into this whole training on the beginning of the universe, I want to start with a verse, and it might sound a little bit out of place, but it'll make sense. It's Mark 10, verse 6, and it's Jesus speaking. And he says, "But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female." He's talking about divorce here, but that's not the topic of today's conversation. Today we're talking about the beginning of the universe. And I wanted to start by highlighting that Jesus himself told us that God created the universe at the beginning. This is outstanding, and it's something that science and logic both support. So stick with me for a few minutes here as we jump into the evidence for the beginning of the universe and how that points to God as creator. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is the value of logical arguments. And this is kind of important as we get into this week's training on the beginning of the universe, because we're going to be going over the cosmological argument. It's a logical argument. You know, in a logical argument, if the premises are true and can't be proven false, and if they lead to the conclusion, then the conclusion is also true. That's how logical arguments work. So if you can't refute one or the other of the premises, then the conclusion stands. What we're going to find out today with the cosmological argument is that you can't refute the premises, so the conclusion is a fact. It's something that stands. Got to tell you a funny story, though. Once there was an atheist that called me and said, "Hey, I want to debate you on your radio show." I said, "Well, great. What would you like to debate about?" And he said, "The moral argument for God's existence." We're going to talk about that soon enough. But the moral argument is compelling evidence for God. The atheist can refute it, but to refute it, you have to throw all morality out. We'll tell you about that more in a couple sessions. Most people aren't willing to do that because nobody would want to live in a society without any standards. So he said, "Let's debate the moral argument." I said, "That's great. How about we also debate the cosmological argument?" And he said, "No, I don't want to do that." I think for obvious reasons. This is a strong and compelling argument. So the Kalam cosmological argument is one that Dr. William Lane Craig has really done most of his work on in modern times. He's a famous Christian philosopher. I love him. I'm sure that you'll really be blessed by a lot of his work. Let me tell you the way he describes the Kalam cosmological argument. First, everything that begins to exist must have a cause for its existence. Second, the universe began to exist, and if those two things are true, the universe has a cause for its existence. And that cause, of course, would be greater than the universe because it caused the entire universe to be. That cause would be what we know as God. Let me get into this argument a little bit more. We're going to touch on some different elements of it. First, I want to tell you a little bit about Einstein. Einstein, of course, is super famous, and sometimes Christians say, "Oh, Einstein was a Christian, therefore Christianity is true." You know, we don't have any evidence that Einstein ever became a Christian, but it does seem that through his work on relativity, he became convinced that a greater power or creator existed. Let me tell you a quote or two of his. He says, "A superior reasoning power which is revealed in the incomprehensible universe exists." And he also said, "An illimitable superior spirit who reveals himself in the slight details that we are able to perceive." He saw these details of what we know as God simply in his observation of creation. And specifically, as he looked at the universe and general relativity and the deep, deep elements of the universe and the laws that govern it, he could see a creator in it all. The beginning of the universe points to a creator. When he did his calculations, a beginning became necessary, and he realized that. But at the time, not believing in God, he came up with a fudge factor to try and get out of that evidence. He later called it the biggest mistake of his career. You know, almost 100 years later, scientists and atheists and skeptics of all sorts are still trying to do the same thing. We're going to talk today about the evidence for the beginning and why that points to a creator. The cosmological argument is logically valid. This is a strong argument for the existence of God. The atheist has to refute one of the two premises if they want to get out of this argument. So let's look at number one. Premise number one says, everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence. That's pretty easy and fair. We don't see things popping into existence out of nothing. To deny this, the atheist has to deny the law of causality. Most aren't even going to try this. Some atheists and skeptics will try to deny this, but they do it in a tricky way. They try to say that we can get something from nothing by redefining nothing. Let me tell you what Michael Shermer does. He says, if we define nothing, the nothing of the vacuum of space, if we say it actually consists of space, time, energy, gravity, turbulence, and the laws of nature, and he says if we grant all that, then we can conclude that nothing can produce something. This is absurd. That's like saying, if we define nothing as something, then we can conclude that something comes from nothing. All right, he's playing absolute word games with us. We all know that nothing doesn't produce nothing. If you've ever had $0 in your bank account, you're probably very familiar with the fact that $0 don't turn into dollars miraculously. We don't get something from nothing in the physical universe. The bottom line is that when an atheist tries to deny this law, they're actually denying the first law of thermodynamics, that matter can't be created or destroyed, that energy can't be created or destroyed. So let's look at premise 2. They can't get out of premise 1, so let's look at premise 2. The universe began to exist. You know, the universe did begin to exist a finite time ago. You're looking now at a picture called the Hubble Ultra Deep Field. This is looking back about 95% in time. So since light travels with good telescopes, you can look way back and see light coming from a distant time. So this is looking back about 95% backwards in time and seeing the early universe and some of the earliest galaxies that existed at that time. It's a really awesome picture that gets close to when the universe began to exist. There are really only two ways that an atheist can get out of the beginning of the universe. One is the cyclical model, that the universe has gone through a series of big bangs and big crunches. You know, recent measurements and recent calculations have absolutely disproved the cyclical model. So most people have shifted to a multiverse approach. This is very popular now for a few different reasons. One, a lot of atheists and skeptics think it gets them out of this problem about the beginning of the universe. It doesn't, because even if it would be an explanation for where this universe came from, it would just be kicking the can down the road. They would still have to have an explanation for where the whole multiverse came from in the first place. We'll get into more of that in a minute. Another reason that they like to use the multiverse is it gets them out of statistical problems with things like evolution. When we get to that topic, several sessions from now, we will realize that statistically, evolution is impossible. So a lot of times, the atheist response will be, in an infinite number of universes, it would have happened somewhere, no matter how statistically impossible. And since we're here, this is where it happened. It's a really creative, not scientific or statistically valid way to approach the argument, but it's one that they like a lot. So let's talk about the multiverse itself. You know, there's no empirical way to verify the multiverse. So technically, it's not even scientific. We can't test it like we have to do with all science. So if we can't test it, it's just a wild idea. Now, I want to be careful to let you know that if the multiverse were real, it would not be a problem for the believer. We believe in a God that created everything. If he chose to create a multiverse and we were just one of the universes in the multiverse, so be it. I don't know of a Christian that has a problem with that. The problem for the atheist, though, is that there isn't a way to empirically observe or test the multiverse. It's just a just-so story. So instead of looking at the science and following where it goes, the fact that we have only one observable universe, the atheist posits a hypothetical multiverse to get them out of the trouble of a creator that would be the outcome of a universe that was created. So they play some tricks on us to get out of the reality that the beginning of the universe points to a creator. It's at this point that the atheist might throw out some red herrings, like, well, if you have to have a cause for everything, what caused God? They're tricking us here because the cosmological argument doesn't say we have to have a cause for everything. It says everything that begins to exist must have a cause for its existence. Here's the important thing to remember. For anything to exist at all, there has to be something that exists in its own nature, namely God. It didn't get existence from something else. And for that something to exist in its own nature, it can't have ever been created. So the idea of a creator God that is the source of all existence is a metaphysically necessary idea. It's philosophically necessary. And that idea of a God that exists, that created all other things, is something that doesn't need an answer for its cause, because by definition, it did not begin to exist. Since God did not begin to exist, we don't need to explain a cause for his existence. The atheist might also say something like, oh, you're just referring to the God of the gaps. Since science hasn't found an answer yet, you're just positing God because you don't have a scientific answer. Again, here we have to remind them, no, we're not appealing to a God of the gaps here, right? We are following the science that we know is true. All scientific observation in human history tells us that effects have causes. We don't get something from nothing. So based on what we've observed for millennia as human beings, we know that the effect of the universe itself requires a cause. And that cause would have to be greater than the universe that was caused by that cause, namely God. The universe had a supernatural beginning a finite time ago. That's a fact, and it points us right at the existence of God. Let me tell you a famous quote by Robert Jastrow, the founding director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies. He said, "For the scientist who has lived by faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak, and as he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries." In other words, as an agnostic scientist, a famous one at that, he found that after scaling all the cliffs of reason and science, he came to the conclusion the Christians and the Bible had it right all along. There's a creator. Let me tell you a little bit about entropy. This is another thing that a lot of Christians get wrong. This is the second law of thermodynamics, that everything in the universe is trending towards disorder. That's kind of a layman's way of understanding it. A lot of people incorrectly use that to fight against evolution. They say if everything is generally trending towards disorder, then how could evolution create more order? I'm not defending evolution, and in a future session, we're going to tell you why evolution doesn't work. But for now, I just want to make a note that entropy is not a good answer to evolution, because entropy is always increasing in a closed system, not in an open system. Take, for example, your kids' rooms. Entropy does not always increase in your kids' rooms. When I tell my kids I'll give them $1 to clean their room, they clean their room. Entropy in that room decreases. At the same time, though, entropy in the universe as a whole increases. Let me tell you why entropy is important. Across the entire universe, entropy is always increasing. And the fact that it hasn't reached infinity yet tells us that we have not been here for all of eternity. It tells us that we began as a universe to exist a finite time ago. It's kind of like this. If you're driving down the road and you're looking at your gas gauge, there's an E on there. And if you haven't yet hit E, you can know with confidence you haven't been driving for forever. If you'd been driving for forever, you would have hit E by now. The fact that entropy hasn't gone to infinity tells us we haven't been here forever. And here's what's important. If we haven't been here forever, that means that we began to exist, which tells us there was a creator. That's the conclusion that almost drove Einstein mad many, many years ago. Okay, so let me bring up a topic here that's important. It's the Big Bang. Scientists refer to that beginning event as the Big Bang. And a lot of Christians incorrectly think that the Big Bang is a rebuttal of creation. The Big Bang does not get us out of creation. In fact, it was a term of derision that Fred Hoyle used when scientists began to spread the evidence that there had been a beginning. He said, what do you want to call it, a Big Bang or something like that? Because he believed what many had up until that time, that the universe had existed for eternity. He knew that if it had a starting point that pointed to a creator, he didn't want to accept that. So he said, what was it, just a Big Bang? Anyway, the title stuck. Here's what I want you to catch as a believer. I believe in creation. The Big Bang is just the scientist's term that they apply to the evidence for that beginning event. So when someone mentions the Big Bang, instead of jumping all over it and freaking out about the term, I want to go a little bit deeper and focus on the cosmological argument. I want to ask them what's behind the beginning of the universe. Here's how Ravi Zacharias describes it. He says, if the Big Bang is where it all began, may I ask what preceded the Big Bang? That's a good question that we could ask too, to surface the more important issue of where it all began. So when a scientist or a neighbor or a skeptic or somebody, maybe a teacher, throws out the Big Bang, instead of arguing with them about terms, let's go to the cosmological argument. What caused this whole universe to spring into existence a finite time ago? Because scientists and Christians alike agree that is a fact. Okay, so we believe in creation. We do not believe in a naturalistic explanation for the start of the universe. But when that comes up, let's be careful to bring it back to a cause. So let's kind of summarize some of what we've been talking about here. The cosmological argument is a solid argument for the existence of God. Everything that begins to exist must have a cause for its existence. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe must have a cause for its existence, namely God. The universe has a cause. And here's something that's important to catch. Whatever created the entire known universe must be all-powerful. Whatever created a universe full of intelligence and laws that are always obeyed must be intelligent. Whatever created a universe that brought it into existence must itself be self-existent. You know, time began at the beginning of the universe, so whatever created time must itself be eternal and timeless. And whatever created all this, with the idea that we could look at nature itself and find evidence of that creator, must be good and relational. It made a decision to create at a specific point, so it must have decision-making capabilities. So you tell me, we're talking about something that's all-powerful, it's omnipresent because it's not confined by space, it's timeless and eternal, it's self-existent, it's intelligent, it's relational, it makes decisions. Sounds a lot to me like what we know as God, the biblical definition of one true God that created the universe. Scientists have got backed into a corner where we have to realize that the evidence for the beginning of the universe points directly to God. Science has done us a whole lot of favors as Christians. Hey, I don't want you to miss the next training. We're going to be getting into E, the engineering for the universe. It's going to be absolutely outstanding. It's going to be exciting. We're going to learn a lot about how to defend our faith. Don't miss that next training. Definitely go to GreatCommissionAlliance.org/shop, get the Best Facts Workbook, get the Best Facts Track for Skeptics, and definitely go to GreatCommissionAlliance.org/training for all of our trainings, including this one. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you are blessed by today's message. We'll see you next time. All right. Well, we are so thankful that you stuck with us through the first two Best Facts sessions. We're going to jump into a little bit of Q&A here, just a few minutes. We ought to be done right about 11 o'clock Mountain Time. So we had a few questions that came in via text, and I want to get to those right now. The first one was something that I think a lot of us could relate to. Is somebody that grew up in a Christian family and mentioned that they now feel skeptical about everything. So I wanted to start by first addressing the issue of skepticism and doubt. So first of all, let me just read you a quote by G.K. Chesterton that I love. G.K. Chesterton wrote more than 100 years ago, but he was way ahead of his time. Let's read what he says in Orthodoxy. He says, "The new rebel is a skeptic, and he won't really trust anything. But the fact that he doubts everything really gets in his way when he wants to denounce anything. And by rebelling against everything, he has lost his right to rebel against anything." What happens a lot of times when we become extreme in our skepticism is that we pull the rug out from under ourselves about skepticism itself. When we start to think everything needs to be questioned, we lose the bedrock facts that life and knowledge and wisdom are grounded in. And so we can't just pull the rug out from under ourselves. Let me get to the topic of doubt based on that. There are two different types of doubt that I want you to understand. There's emotional doubt and intellectual doubt. Something else you need to catch is that everyone has doubt, right? The atheist doubts. C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity has that famous quote about how as a Christian, there are very few nights that he lies awake questioning it all. But as an atheist, there are very many nights where he lied awake questioning his atheism. Classic, honest example of doubt as an atheist. You're going to have doubt about the jobs that you get hired in and the profession that you pursue. You'll probably buy a house at some point in life and doubt whether or not it was the right house to buy. You might buy a car, and when you encounter some problems with it, you might doubt whether or not that was the right car to buy. You might be in a relationship where occasionally, even though it's a good relationship, you might doubt whether you should be in that relationship. There are a million different things that as a human being, you are going to have doubt about. That's for Christians, non-Christians, that's for atheists and theists, that's for all different people. And so when we have doubt, it does not necessarily imply that the object of our doubt is false. The fact that we have doubt is just a human issue. Now let me get back to that topic of emotional versus intellectual doubt. Intellectual doubt is when you have a doubt about something and you have not yet had a good answer for it. Take, for example, the resurrection. Maybe you think, how could I believe in a resurrection? How could a dead man rise again? I used to doubt the resurrection tremendously, especially the possibility of my own life after death. Now here's the reality. The evidence for Christ's resurrection is literally irrefutable. Even one of the greatest skeptics alive today basically admits that in his attempts to refute that. I can explain more on that in a future session on the resurrection. But for now, I'll just tell you that the evidence for the resurrection is solid. So let's say you have a doubt about the evidence for the resurrection. That's an intellectual doubt because you've never heard the answer yet. But then you become exposed to the evidence for the resurrection. For example, maybe you do the Best Facts training, or you get one of Gary Habermas's books. Dr. Habermas is the expert on the resurrection. And then you get the answers, the evidence for the resurrection. Now that intellectual doubt has been satisfied with an intellectual response, with an answer. What happens next, though, is you can continue to doubt that issue. Could Jesus really have risen from the dead? Could I really rise from the dead? Now the doubt is no longer intellectual. There's a good intellectual answer to your doubt. Now the doubt is emotional doubt. It's that continuing to go over and over and over and over something that we've already found the answer to. Most doubt is emotional doubt. It's that nagging. It's that I wonder if. It's the what if questions that keep on keeping us awake at night. I've been through many years of that. And the older I've gotten and the more I've done apologetics, the fewer doubts hit me. And when they do, they're typically fleeting. And here's why. The bedrock of evidence is so strong that a little doubt over here doesn't overthrow it all. I can rest assured in the predominant amount of evidence that I have. Take, for example, your marriage if you're married. And if you're not, take, for example, my marriage. I could always be doubting whether or not my spouse, my wife, Erin, really loves me. I have tremendous evidence that she does. So there's no intellectual reason to have that doubt, but I could still always be wrestling with that doubt internally. That would be an emotional doubt. When I have that kind of doubt, I need to take it back to the evidence and deal with the emotional doubt with the evidence. So a lot of believers deal with doubt, as do a lot of other people. What happens typically for non-believers, I think, is they try to ignore it. I've talked to so many atheists that say, I never think about those things. They try to put them out of their mind, things like life and death and all that type of stuff. And so what we need to get comfortable with doing as believers is taking our doubts back to the truth. There's a great book on this topic. It's actually more of a psychological book, but it's called Telling Yourself the Truth. And we need to get good at that as Christians. When we have a doubt, we take it back to the truth and we deal with it. Now, if you're doubting, to whoever sent this text message in, I just want you to know there was a doubter in the New Testament, Thomas. And Jesus didn't kick him out and say, you're out of here, bro. He met him where he was at, full of compassion, and he answered his doubts with evidence. We can do the same with the evidence today. I hope you'll stick with us for the rest of the Best Facts trainings. Okay, this same person said that they were born into a Christian family and they realized that anyone born into a certain religious context might take for granted that that is true without looking deeper into the historical evidence. And they brought up Islam, for example. You know, I would encourage you to read Nabil Qureshi's book, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, or No God But One. Both of those books are important books by Qureshi, and they talk about the difference between Islam and Christianity. In fact, when we get to the Tall Tales acronym, we're going to give you reasons that other faiths don't have the kind of evidence that Christianity has. There are good reasons not to believe Islam, okay? But we're not going to focus on that today, because my hope is that we would focus on the reasons to believe in Jesus, to believe in the Bible. The historical Jesus is another question that came in. How do we know who the historical Jesus was? Because there's this big historical Jesus movement that tries to say the evangelical perspective on the historical Jesus is wrong. That movement, I tell you today, is completely biased. And I'm not alone in saying that. It's kind of been a while since this was at the top of things, but you might remember some of the historical Jesus movement and some of the things that were going on in that, where they would really make decisions about what was true or not about what Jesus said or didn't say simply by votes, by casting votes with different colors of pebbles and things like that. This was an insane way to approach the evidence and not something that a historian would do. In a couple sessions, we're going to talk about the truth about Jesus, and we're going to go over the characteristics that historians use today, and we're going to apply those to the evidence for Jesus. And you'll see that even by the strictest standards of modern history, the truth of Jesus is the truth that we as evangelical Christians know to be true of him. The evangelical Jesus is the historical Jesus. Let me just give you a little contrast. The biggest skeptic alive today would say Jesus was just an itinerant preacher that nobody thought was God until 100 years after he died. And that idea is insane. I mean, we have people during Christ's lifetime that recognized his deity. That same author would say John, writing in 90 AD, the last gospel, was the first one to talk about the deity of Christ. That same author fails to tell us that Mark, the first gospel, writing maybe 30 years prior to John, in chapter 2 twice talks about the deity of Christ. He attributes the power to forgive sins to Jesus in Mark chapter 2, something that the Jews of that time knew only God could do, and they tried to kill him for blasphemy when he did that. And in the same chapter, he quotes Jesus as calling himself the Lord of the Sabbath. the God who gave the Ten Commandments. So we realize that it is disingenuous to try and say that the historical Jesus was a convention of the 2nd century and not something that was in the original manuscripts. Mark talks about it. Hey, Matthew, writing shortly after Mark, calls Jesus Emmanuel, God with us, in the 1st chapter of Matthew. I could go on and on and on, but I don't have time to deal with that now. What I can tell you for certain is that the historical Jesus is not the one that modern skeptics have tried to convey. They are forcing a skeptical approach onto a historical figure, and they cannot do that. Now, let me tell you their background in this. It's called Metaphysical Naturalism. You know, scientists use methodological naturalism, where they go into a lab and they use natural explanations for natural phenomena. That's okay. We have no problem with that. There's a philosophical jump from there, though, that says there are only natural explanations in natural phenomena. There's no way that you could ever prove such a thing, right? There's no way that we could ever prove that there are only atoms and molecules and that there's no supernatural anything. But that idea, that comes in and pervades everything else we believe and teach. In other words, it would make us believe evolution even if evolution doesn't have the evidence that it's supposed to have. But it also happens in theology, because a skeptic that has assumed metaphysical naturalism cannot believe in a man that rose from the dead and did miracles. And so they force their skeptical metaphysical naturalism onto the historical evidence, and they interpret what really happened through that lens. That's actually very different than following the evidence. We as Christians actually have fewer biases than these modern skeptics. Let me tell you how. I am okay with natural answers. I have a chemistry degree. I love science. I'm okay with natural answers. But I also realize that there are things science can't explain. Things like morality, things like history, things like love, things like ethics. Science has boundaries. There is more than just atoms and molecules, so I'm okay with supernatural explanations as well. I don't posit them everywhere, but I'm okay with them when there is evidence that points in that direction. The skeptic can't go there because they have a limited worldview that only allows plain materialistic answers. So they've pigeonholed themselves into a corner that they really can't follow the evidence where it leads, and that's a dangerous thing. You know, some questions also came up about the gospel writers and their artistic license. The gospel writers didn't use artistic license. There are tens of thousands of times that they've been corroborated archaeologically. And we're going to get into that in a few sessions from now when we talk about the translation of Scripture, which is a T in the FACTS acronym. So please stay tuned for more of that coming up soon. One last question is talking about entropy and the universe. We dealt with that a lot in the session, but the entropy across the universe as a whole is increasing, and that tells us, since it hasn't reached infinity, that we haven't been here for eternity. In other words, there was a starting point. But the entropy in an open system like Earth can be decreasing as long as it's increasing in the universe as a whole. It's a complicated topic. We'll get into that in one of the last sessions on evolution. Hey, that's about it for our Q&A today. Definitely stay tuned for our upcoming Best Facts training session on Thursday, 10 a.m. Mountain Time. We don't want you to miss it. Please let others know as well. And definitely get excited to learn more on Thursday. Hey, thanks so much for tuning into the Best Facts live stream today. We'll talk to you again soon.